I've been toying with doing some responses to this work by Jonathan Haidt, a lot of it in The Righteous Mind, some of it what he's done after The Righteous Mind, which is his most famous book. A lot of it boils down to political differences, and I keep getting videos. Like, I'll click on one video by Jonathan Haidt after going on a steady avoidance of Jonathan Haidt for months, but I'll click on one video and then I'm just assaulted by video recommendations over and over and over. Just nothing but political Haidt speeches and lectures and presentations. So the algorithm likes him very much, at least in my case. And it's kind of annoying because I'm 50-50 on him at best. So here's one video titled Predisposed Liberals, Conservatives, and the Biology of Political Differences. So he's been at the forefront of this, I don't want to say movement, but I'll refer to it as a movement for lack of a better term, revitalizing the notion that biology figures into this fairly prominently. Because of course he casts it in terms of political identity, and even beyond that, like political personality. Breathes life into the old stereotypes. As opposed to the way I would cast these issues, it's just a matter of policy clusters. And they don't even have to be internally consistent. Right? The moment you do away with the idea that there is such a thing as a, let's say, optimally progressive policy cluster, an optimally centrist policy cluster, an optimally conservative policy cluster, the moment you do away with that, the whole idea of political identity, let alone political personality, is just evaporates. And all we're left with are isolated policies to be taken in standalone ways, to be debated and considered in these standalone ways. But if you want to be a political expressivist, if you're just here to express yourself, hashtag not my president, hashtag whatnot, then yeah, a lot of this thing will seem appealing, and you can almost make it seem feasible that biology figures into it. The reason I'm very skeptical that biology figures into it at all, and I'll do an abridged version of this, I'm not sure whether I'll go into it at length, but I can go into it at length depending on what I get as a response to this, because I'm not even sure that anyone who watches me is at all convinced by it. If no one who watches me is convinced by it, then there's really no sense in doing an unabridged rebuking of it. But one reason that I'm skeptical of it is people who are minimalistically involved in politics, in my experience, they don't change their views on politics. Because all they run on is their political identity. And so it's narrative before policy, right? The narratives are prior to the policies. Whereas people who are knee-deep into politics, political junkies, political scientists, all that sort of crowd, very much the policy considerations are first and foremost, and narratives, if they're prevalent at all, are very much in the background, and sometimes not at all. Right? And so those are the kind of people who expose themselves to the best of the best, not lowbrow arguments, not even middlebrow arguments, but highbrow arguments. Those are the types of people who view everything in isolation, who don't believe anything is interconnected, very much each policy is detached, and who at the end of the day are very likely to change their views. So all this data that Jonathan Haidt rests his thesis on, that biology is some driver of this, a considerable driver of this, it's all the test subjects. I'm pretty sure if you actually shows how much time they've spent reading the best possible arguments against their position, it'll be like hovering around 0%. And the people who are the most informed are also the most likely to change their views. So the moment you cast it in those terms, all this goes away. I'd just love to see the test subjects and their individual histories, how much time they've spent reading up on all the topics that they claim to be interested in, the composites of what makes up what they view as their political identity. And of course, again, they don't view it as a composite of the individual topics that they have a pro or nay attitude towards, but that's all that is. If it's going to be at all sensible, it can't be anything other than that. It can't be a token. It has to be a composite of policies. And it's a damn shame that we don't have access to those kinds of histories. To the best of my knowledge, no such study has ever been run. The studies that Haidt relies on, they always treat each subject, test subject, survey subject, as just this same identical slate. He talks a lot about the dangers of the blank slate, but the problem with the studies is they treat all the subjects as blank slates. So let's just do a different kind of survey, because we know that it is possible, right? Even though he believes, biology figures into this somewhat, he must be aware that it is possible that people change their views and change them drastically, right? Now, if there's a certain way that biology would make those kinds of changes modest at best, but we know thousands, tens of thousands of people, if we go worldwide, change their views not just modestly but radically and drastically. Yeah, so again, that would have to defy biology. So how small would that number of people have to be for us to consider that too trivial to pose a threat to the biological explanation? And then how large would it have to get to the point where, maybe this undermines the biological explanation if this many people changes their minds? And the reason I would think it's interesting is because in the context of the surveys that he relies on, if we could actually split the survey subjects by A, the amount of time they spend reading on all these topics they claim to be interested in, that's number one. And then number two, the caliber of the data or the literature that they are selecting. Not low quality, but high quality. Because I guarantee you, the higher the quality of the information and the thought, the caliber of thought and the authors that they're exposing themselves to, the more likely they are going to be to reconsider things. But of course, with the world as it actually exists, most of the things that people are being exposed to is things in the way of nut packing, lowest common denominator type exposure to the outgroup. Blue state, red state media always selects for these sorts of things, and people are always fed a steady diet of that. The majority of people. And the very few that don't, they fall into two camps. Broadly speaking, two camps. Camp one is the visible camp. See them all the time. They are sort of the internet's prostitutes, you can say. I've always seen Stefan Molyneux as the brightest example of it. Someone who's clearly too smart to buy into the majority of stuff that he's talking about, but he sees an opening, and god damn it, he's going to milk it for all it's worth. In a matter of a couple of years, he's done a full 180, because it's all about that opening. It's all about the next demo that he can seize upon, and seize upon it he has. So just cynical opportunism because it's profitable, right? Not because he genuinely has a conviction suddenly, right? The sort of convictions he's having circa 2015 onward, polar opposite of the major convictions he's had prior to 2015. So, clear example, just whichever way the wind blows within a certain demo that he might think is going to be sympathetic enough to him, he'll run with that wind. That's one example. And of course, these are the profitable, visible people who I don't think have convictions themselves, but who nonetheless act as if they do. But they see through the bullshit. They know the score, but they're going to pretend they don't know the score, because it's easier that way and more profitable. And then camp two is the invisible camp. People who see through the exact same things, but who are disgusted by the prospect of taking advantage of it and milking it for all it's worth, and are thus invisible as a result. So, right. That's the other point. And another reason why none of it can be biological is because we see just how drastically different politics circa 2019 is compared to politics circa 1919, and how different 1919 was compared to 1619. And you can just go from any pocket of history and even regional considerations to see that if it had been biology, well, god damn it, the positions changed far more than the biology could have possibly within the same time span. So explain that. No, you can't. Of course you can't. And I guess the final point would be that he talks about in terms of moral roots, as if one's moral philosophy is supposed to be a mirror image of one's political philosophy. If that were the case, well, why even have the two different names? Just call them the same thing. Obviously, there's got to be some kind of line between one's political philosophy and moral philosophy. It can be influenced by, the former can be influenced by the latter, but the way Haidt talks, he talks about as if that line is supposed to be just directly straightforward. And no, for any right-thinking pragmatist, it's got to be a roundabout line. So I'm confident that, well, while he's a good faith actor, while he's doing what he thinks is best, at the end of the day, the mental models that he is peddling and that he is responsible for sort of bringing back into the political consciousness, they're going to do far more muddying than clarifying. They are not going to be productive in terms of conflict resolution, even though that's his whole pitch, is that he is good at conflict resolution. But the moment he's stuck on the political identity narrative, validating the idea that these identities are something other than incredibly fuzzy, that they are lifelong effects. You can't even do this with personal identity, let alone political identity. I can point you to papers that show your 14-year-old self is unrecognizable to your 77-year-old self, as the headline of a recent article I read states. So, like, if personal identity can survive this sort of time-based scrutiny, how the hell does the highly abstract political identity have any hope of coming anywhere close to surviving it? Oh, it doesn't, right? So you validate the identity framing, you validate horseshit and thought-terminating cliches. And why do people validate them? Well, because they're just not even asking the basic primary question. The primary question is, when you are voicing an opinion on something political, are you saying, this is the kind of society I want to live in? Well, I think that's what most people are doing, but also they don't see how that also reverberates into the sort of statement, this is what I would prescribe for the entire world. And now I'm very mindful not to make that sort of mistake. Whatever society I want to live in is completely irrelevant when I'm on here uploading videos to a global medium that I know will be watched by people who are highly incorrigible and who, at least on many policies that don't cause, let's say, the policies that they would disagree with me on, but the result of that disagreement is not profound unfairness or extreme harm coming to some minority within that society, then yeah, all those kinds of disputes, there's a single metric for solving them: majoritarian rule. That's it. So, two exceptions aside, extreme unfairness, extreme hardships, those two aside, all that's left is who's got the majority. Have I been persuasive enough? If I haven't been persuasive enough, if they are incorrigible, then it simply does not matter to me what kind of society I would like to live in. If they're not agreeing with what I'm saying, even though they've heard me and they've comprehended my points, then what I believe ought to be the case, in the strictest sense of normative, is the majority of that society should rule the day. Not my ideals, not my vision of any sort. So people need to get on board with this. When you're prescribing something, you got to do it for a great number of policies. At the end of the day, it's about majoritarian will. Not what you would like to see for your locality or precinct or what have you. Completely irrelevant. Interruption. Sorry, but I have to, because I should be ashamed of myself for not including what is really the mother of all qualifiers in the initial recording. Started making the point I was making in that initial recording. I will continue making it, but it's incomplete. Once you complete it, it's a perfectly fair point to make, but I didn't complete it. Because I was talking about knowledge of policies at the level of ordinary politics. The stuff wonks talk about, the stuff pundits talk about. And that's all well and good, but I made it seem as if the more you increase knowledge of that, the more you will decrease stubbornness and zealotry, I guess. And that's not the case. There's actually an inverse correlation when it comes to stuff like that. You can just enhance your clever reasoning the more ammo you have, empirical ammo, and you can be very selective. And that's usually what a lot of policy wonks and not like academic policy wonks, but the sort of more pundit-like policy wonks do. And I'm not encouraging that. I'm encouraging the whole package, the completion of the point, which is don't just study ordinary politics. That's not going to get you anywhere. You got to study metapolitics. There's a vast literature on metapolitics, and that ties into cognitive psychology. So the moment you go deep into cognitive psychology, you'll see things that no amount of knowledge of ordinary politics and policies will help you see. I'm talking things like the connection between cultural identity and political identity. Because for a lot of people, political identity is just downstream from cultural identity. Like Bannon catches a lot of flack for saying politics is just downstream of culture, and it's funny because the only way you actually see to the extent that he is right on the money with that is by looking at how many people's political identities just take their cues from their cultural identities. And it's a very vicious pipeline. And of course the whole pipeline is personal identity, cultural identity, political identity. And I can critique the first two, because there shouldn't be a pipeline whatsoever, but a truly invidious part is the connection between the cultural and the political ones. And you should do away with them. So I'll link to some of the stuff as a sort of introductory, some of the stuff I've written about, and then some of the stuff that's actually out there as formal literature warning about that. A lot of stuff in the way of the fluidity of political stances, and how the way you set something up can actually have the subject who is being tested, who claims to have a conviction, you can have them do a 180 based on how you frame the issue and based on what kind of allies you tell them they're having on that issue, who endorses the issue and who doesn't. If the people that they've already viewed as their allies, if you tell them that they actually endorse that issue, a lot of people will straight up just anchor themselves in that direction, even though going in they thought of themselves as not being an advocate of that particular issue. So it's very important to actually study the whole package and not just issues at the object level. You gotta study the issues at the meta level in order to get the full picture of what I'm discussing here. And unfortunately, I didn't include that when I initially made the points I was making here. So throughout the video, this point will not be made in the original recording. So just be mindful that when I'm talking about political knowledge, I mean meta level political knowledge, not just the ordinary stuff. Can't stress that enough, and especially when you connect one type of identity to the other, and just the amount of flimsy reasoning that goes into these kinds of dot connections, because they are what grounds these sorts of findings in social experiments where people think they have some kind of a connection, but the moment you show that the peer group, the moment you fabricate information about the peer group not endorsing that conviction, the subject changes their minds on that conviction. It's all very peer related. And I don't see how it's possible for someone to expose themselves to that sort of information and do what people typically do, what the policy wonks typically do, in the way of clever rationalizing and selection. No. The only way you do that is when you haven't exposed yourself to the literature in the way of cognitive psychology. So, crucial stuff, and the fluidity of beliefs. Alright, so what you saw there is me just kind of making history in the sense that I've let recordings sit and gather dust and just kind of, I'll get around to it. I've let that happen, and maybe a month, 2 months later, I finally action it and put it together or complete it. In this case, it's from 2019, so I'm following up now on a couple of recordings from over 2 years ago, late 2019. I don't know why I finally decided to follow up on this stuff. At some point, I kind of said, I can do this better. But then I rewatched it a few days ago, and I'm like, you know what? This is a good enough introduction to a video that initially I didn't follow up on because I knew I wanted to plow through so much literature that it was going to take a lot of work, and then weeks turn to months, months turn to years, and then I just realized I've got this pretty decent intro to a video. But at the same time, I'm in a completely different mindset now in late 2021. 2019, 2020, I was in this mindset of every video needs to be super long. Now I'm transitioning to a not so long video threshold. So instead of doing what I wanted to do, and that involved initially reading from a number of papers pretty much entirely, top to bottom, now what I'm going to do is just screenshot a few things or screen record a few things and read from papers that reinforce these points I was making, but read only like paragraph chunks as opposed to entirety, because initially I wanted this to be like a 2-hour video, and that itself functioned as a kind of disincentive to keep working on it because I knew it was going to entail a lot of work. A lot of the reasons I record stuff and then don't follow up on it is because I create these insanely difficult demands in terms of what is the completed video. And so it's going to be a shortcut, but I will in fact follow up. And before I get to the literature itself that I think does wonders for every single point I raised, I want to get a bit into jargon. We know internalism and externalism exists in epistemology. We know it exists in terms of talking about motivational profiles. But I really do think it's sorely lacking in political theory. And here I'm talking about metapolitical theory. I've made some noises in the past about political foundationalism, political contextualism, ragging on foundationalism, pushing contextualism. There's no such thing as just doing politics from scratch without looking at facts on the ground. Anyone who does that opens themselves up to the sort of critique where they might think it makes sense to talk of something that is clearly political as being good in theory but not in practice. Whereas I'm of the view that if something's just not good in practice, it is therefore ipso facto not good in theory to the extent that we're talking about political theory. Like, political theory is on arrival supposed to be something that is good in practice in the world as it actually exists, not some imagined world of the future. You want to talk about the imaginary world of the future, the prognosis world, the forecasted world, then you're not dealing with partisan divides as they actually exist. So you're not talking about anything that's political. For it to be political, it has to be something that is practicable. And I'm the first to talk about stuff that's pre-political. Do it quite often. Like right now, I'm on this hobby horse of bioenhancement and opposition to bioconservatism. This is kind of an interesting debate, but it is so far removed from anything that is in any country within the Overton window. It's not just a little removed. It is galaxies away from any Overton window that when I talk about bioenhancement and how I see it as a solution to so many problems, I don't cloak it in political terms. I don't build it into any sort of political theory. I just talk about it from an ethical grounding. And so my pro attitudes in terms of bioenhancement are these evaluatively laced, apolitical pro attitudes. But that's not how a lot of people think, and I just think that's a category mistake. To say of something within your political theory that it works in theory but not in practice, and not seeing how those two things don't jive. The moment something works in theory but not in practice, it is immediately to be excluded from political discourse. But not all discourse, just this acutely political discourse. And people just can't seem to make that sort of connection. That's really hard to accept because we're all just trained reflexively to assume foundationalism for our metapolitics as opposed to contextualism. But I talked about also internalism and externalism. Now, why did I bring that up? Because it's so fitting for this debate. This debate that kind of tries to normalize the idea of a political identity and personality, and Jonathan Haidt talking about politics being more than 50% heritable, political belief being more than 50% heritable. And I think the clearest line to draw in the sand here is the line between the political internalists, people who think that we're not really responsive to reasons when it comes to the political. We just believe what we do. It's like kind of quasi-neurological, things that resonate with us and don't. And there's just no amount of rigorous argumentation, disciplined argumentation, and exposure to the best possible views that are going to get certain people to budge. Those are the internalists. I'm making an argument here for political externalism. And the big punchline is
the most fierce critics of identity politics, whichever type of identitarianism it is, the most fierce critics of identity politics are those who just assume this. They assume political internalism, that whatever we believe, we'll keep on believing it. We may budge to some extent, but because this is heritable, right, as Jonathan Haidt and even Steven Pinker, I'm sorry to say, we can't really go the whole way. But the moment you accept internalism, and we might even call it political essentialism, I think I'll use the word essentialism in the title here, really what that is that opens the door to a kind of, not a textbook identitarianism, but a kind of anterior identitarianism that just taps out. Right? This textbook identitarianism assumes that there's no way to argue someone out of a commitment to be on board with a group that they align with because of these immutable characteristics. Right? So whether that's race, biological sex, gender, sexual orientation, all these things. Ageism can come along for the right, but it doesn't often. As long as it's an immutable characteristic and you're really wanting to push that group's political interest, you're engaging in identity politics, and that's bad. But really, this psychological, biological even, as Haidt would say, kind of white flag, it is a white flag that says at some point we all tap out when it comes to being reason responsive, because it's heritable to a large extent. These people don't notice the extent to which they themselves open themselves up to a kind of anterior identitarianism. Because if it just comes down to these brute convictions that are not reason responsive or even reason sensitive and are neurologically wired, well then why wouldn't each clan just kind of cloister around those neurological, psychological, temperamental, and ultimately biological, I guess, shared features, and do what is essentially analogous to identity politics and perhaps equivalent to identity politics? Why would that not be the prescriptively wise thing to do? On my account, the political externalist account, well, I can give perfect reasons as to why. We should all keep arguing the point. If someone insists makes sense, it doesn't resonate with us, keep the debate going. Keep it going for as long as possible, not to change the world, but just as an intellectual exercise. No two people who have identical information, access to more information, who are situated in a way that can make them see the point of this, the point of the opposite view, they should not disagree.
Let me interrupt myself right there. I went on to talk about this disagreement stuff, but I didn't parse what I meant by disagreement, because broadly there's three types of disagreement, and factual disagreement is one, purely non-factual disagreement that still has to do with certain kinds of propositions and propositional attitudes. And then the third one, with a fair amount of ambiguity, is where one kind of trades on the other. And the purely factual and this middle ground, ambiguous types of disagreements are what I went on to talk about there, about how these things can be improved with this strict, rigorous, disciplined argumentation. The purely non-factual style disagreements, that requires a kind of philosophy seminar beyond the scope of what I was talking about in that clip that I just interrupted. And I'm not going to return to it because so much of what I said from there on out hinged on that. And so we just need to move on, because I've got so much here, as you can see, that I need to kind of all connect together. I don't know if I'm going to successfully do that, because I'm going to have to rush through it. But it's important to stress that the types of argumentation I'm talking about are those that are purely over facts, and the types of disagreement that hinge on just facts of the matter, kind of mundane affairs, and places where we don't know for sure whether we're just disputing the facts of the matter or whether certain kinds of pre-factual affairs are causing the disagreement. So this kind of ambiguity, middle path. But the pre-factual stuff, I know that it's very demanding to assume that more knowledge is going to cure that. And yes, a certain amount of stuff that we're disputing here is purely pre-factual, but nonetheless propositional, I believe.
But I think the bulk of it still has to do with facts in one or another way, indirectly or directly. And so what I didn't specify in the clip as well is that when I'm talking about gaining more knowledge, it's more about understanding, which a lot of philosophers understand as a kind of superior epistemic state to knowledge. But that's also very controversial, and that's also kind of another completely detached issue that I don't need to pile into this video. Here, I'm just going to talk about how, to start with, there's a lot of papers I want to skim, but to start with, the word polarization, so few people have the sort of prefix to it. When they say polarization, they don't specify whether they're talking about affective polarization or ideological polarization. In America, and this looks at worldwide measurements of affective polarization, but I find that just in America, more so than in any other country, affective polarization drives ideological polarization. And people who discuss polarization and even write books about it, from the best of my memory, they don't parse these two types of polarization. And the moment you don't, it kind of almost seems as if you're trying to get everyone to do some sort of a kumbaya by treating polarization as a negative. I mean, purely ideological polarization doesn't have to be a negative. The problem really is when affective polarization drives ideological polarization. And so this looks at it worldwide, but the study that I did want to actually read the abstract is this one. Affective polarization, local context, and public opinion in America. So affective polarization has become a defining feature of 21st century US politics, but we do not know how it relates to citizens' policy opinions. Answering this question has fundamental implications not only for understanding the political consequences of polarization, but also for understanding how citizens form preferences. And here I think they mean preference bundles, because it's very simple to talk about preferences and rationally ordered preferences one by one, which sadly, I'm sorry to say, people don't think about analytically, because if you have preferences, they have to be rationally ordered. And then to make that even more complicated, you not only have to rationally order them on an individual basis, but you have to rationally order them as bundles. But we'll set that aside from now. Under most political circumstances, this is a difficult question to answer, but the novel coronavirus pandemic allows us to understand how partisan animus contributes to opinion formation. Using a two-wave panel that spans the outbreak of COVID-19, we find that a strong association between citizens' levels of partisan animosity and their attitude about the pandemic, as well as the actions they take in response to it. This relationship, however, is more muted in areas with severe outbreaks of the disease. Our results make clear that narrowing of issue divides requires not only policy discourse, but also addressing affective partisan hostility. And for time reasons, I'll just read the abstract of this one and then move on to Depolarizing American Voters. Democrats and Republicans are equally susceptible to false attitude feedback. Abstract. American politics is becoming increasingly polarized, which biases decision-making and reduces open-minded debate. So Haidt has it wrong. This is why it connects to what Haidt's talking about. Like, it really shouldn't be this, all these different types of pre-rational problems that are learned, not inherited, but learned, as we'll find out as the more we read in terms of these studies and their abstracts and conclusions. Let me start from scratch instead of just tangenting all the time. American politics is becoming increasingly polarized. See, if this had been largely heritable, the term becoming would seem out of place. Which biases decision-making and reduces open-minded debate. In 2 experiments, we demonstrate that despite this polarization, a simple manipulation can make people express and endorse less polarized views about competing political candidates. In study 1, we approached 136 participants at the first 2016 presidential debate and on the streets of New York City. Participants completed the survey evaluating Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump on various personality traits. 72% gave responses favoring a single candidate. We then covertly manipulated their surveys so that the majority of their responses became moderate instead. Participants only noticed and corrected a few of these manipulations. When asked to explain their responses, 94% accepted the manipulated responses as their own and rationalized this neutral position accordingly, even though they reported more polarized views moments earlier. And yes, this does have implications for this view of heritability in terms of political prescriptions. I mean, he would take it further. He would take it to moral heritability, which I'll get to as well, but let's just plow on ahead. I mean Jonathan Haidt. In study 2, we replicated the experiment online with a more politically diverse sample of 498 participants. Both Clinton and Trump supporters showed nearly identical rates of acceptance and rationalization of their manipulated to neutral position. These studies demonstrate how false feedback can powerfully shape the expression of political views. More generally, our findings reveal the potential for open-minded discussion even in a fundamentally divided political climate. Party over policy, the dominating impact of group influence on political beliefs. Influence. I need a quick drink of water. Abstract. 4 studies demonstrated the power of group influence in persuasion and people's blindness to it. Even under conditions of effortful processing, attitude towards social policy depended almost exclusively upon the stated position of one's political party. This effect overwhelmed the impact of both the policy's objective content and participants' ideological beliefs. So, you're telling me I play this sort of thing that I'm reading here. Let's say that someone far more colorful read it in a far more colorful way, interesting way, and you just play it during a Super Bowl halftime show. You're telling me that because people have these static views because they inherit them, it's going to make zero change in terms of how they think about the conclusions they reach? It just doesn't fit. Information is what's needed, and understanding. Not necessarily knowledge, but understanding is what's needed to make ground. And sadly, on the nightly news, whether we're talking MSM or whether we're talking about alt media, you're just not going to see these sorts of things shoved in people's faces. The effect overwhelmed the impact of both the policy's objective content and participants' ideological beliefs. And it was driven by a shift in the assumed factual qualities of the policy and in its perceived moral connotations. Nevertheless, participants denied having been influenced by their political group, although they believed that other individuals, especially their ideological adversaries, would be so influenced. The underappreciated role of social identity in persuasion is discussed. The malleability of political attitudes, choice blindness, confabulation, and attitude change. This thesis is an empirical and theoretical investigation of choice blindness, in particular in the domain of political attitudes. Choice blindness is a cognitive phenomenon in which people do not notice dramatic mismatches between what they choose and what they get, while still offering seemingly introspective arguments to explain their putative choice. So you make people aware of this, something will change, and make them aware of it on a grand enough stage where enough of them will hear it. That's going to change the political culture. The meta-theoretical and exposure to it can impact the first order policy debates. I have no doubt of that. And Jonathan Haidt going around talking about the inescapability of what we inherit as a political ideology, that's going to do the opposite of that. That's just going to reinforce and make people feel comfortable with the fact that they haven't challenged themselves to the degree that they could have. And it's infuriating. What would Haidt say? Why doesn't Haidt circulate these sorts of studies as well? Why doesn't he express the least bit of a sign that he is knowledgeable about the existence of these studies? This is social psychology stuff, in line with cognitive psychology stuff. He's a cognitive psychologist. If you just listen to him and nothing but him, you'd get a sense that none of this exists as well-replicated data. is it wrong of me to speculate about some sort of ulterior angle that he might be having? I don't know, but just once I'd like to hear him say something about a study like this, about the malleability of political attitudes, and just how far back it goes. I'm sure he doesn't deny some malleability, but when you read stuff like this, I mean, choice blindness is a cognitive phenomenon in which people do not notice dramatic mismatches between what they choose and what they get, while still offering seemingly introspective arguments to explain their putative choice. In 4 papers, it is demonstrated that the effect also applies to salient political attitudes and evaluations of political candidates. All studies took place in close connection to real elections, and new tools building of the underlying choice blindness methodology has been developed to collect the data. Further, the potential downstream effects are explored, such as influence on voting intentions and lasting attitude changes. The potential mechanisms behind the effect are also investigated, and confabulatory reasoning stands out as an important part in facilitating the observed attitude changes. Right? So, even if he is unconvinced by this, he needs to show that he is aware of it and that he's willing to take it on and explain at length what is wrong with it. I'm not just reading from one study, I'm reading from a bunch of them and trying my best to connect them together because of how freaking important they are in terms of challenging his narratives. So this is the full study, that's just the abstract. And it's an incredibly long study. Admittedly, I haven't read all of it, but I've read a good chunk of it. And just the more I read, the more different, right? The abstract only gives you a very rough picture. But if you read stuff like this, you'll see how, in so many different ways, the ordinary person gets tricked. Not because they're stupid, right? But simply because they haven't exposed themselves to the many ways in which things can go wrong when you're thinking about policy prescriptions and indeed what people would coin as political commitments, but which I would just say should be non-committal but nonetheless situationally necessary. There's so many different ways in which we can go wrong. And people with a big platform ought to spread this kind of information, right? Now, I'm not sure if it would make the world a utopia, but I'm pretty certain it would get us further away from a dystopia, and, well, that's worth something. False beliefs and confabulation can lead to lasting changes in political attitudes. So this somewhat overlaps with the previous ones, so I'll leave that and plow on ahead because we're at 14 minutes now, and, well, that's just approaching the 15-minute mark. I wanted to close this out as soon as possible, but I'm not even halfway in. Okay, so this is a bit different, but I still think it is somewhat, I can connect it to the broad point I'm trying to make. The effects of physical activity on social interactions. The case of trust and trustworthiness. So, there is no doubt that physical activity improves health conditions. However, does it also affect the way people interact? Beyond the obvious effects related to team games, we wonder whether physical activity has in itself some effect on social behavior. Our research focuses on the potential effects of physical activity, on trust and trustworthiness. Specifically, we compare the choices of subjects playing an investment game who were previously exposed to short-time physical activity to others who are not exposed to it, but involved in different simple tasks. On average, we find that subjects exposed to physical activity exhibit more trust and pro-social behaviors than those who are not exposed. These effects are not temporary. Why does it matter for the purposes of this video? It matters because it is extremely consequential in terms of the effects it has on the polity, on how successful the polity is in terms of governing. Trust. Countries with more trust do better in terms of political outcomes. This social trustworthiness is a huge variable, and it's rarely ever discussed. It's not a weak correlation, it is a strong correlation. Norway, Denmark, a couple of countries that are extremely high, I forget right now off the top of my head, but they score extremely high in terms of successful health outcomes for individuals, for their citizens. they are likewise some of the countries with the least amount of corruption and with the best political outcomes. So trust and trustworthiness is driven by physical activity. The healthier people are, the more mutually trusting they are of each other and of their institutions. And of course, you cannot decouple trust in terms of trust of these, whether we're talking governmental or non-governmental institutions, but nonetheless political institutions. You cannot decouple that from the success of the polity. So in a kind of indirect way, linear way, but perhaps closer to, indirect than direct way, the more healthy a nation is, the more successful it's going to be in terms of governance, because of this kind of tripartite connection between these three things. So the only way to convince me otherwise is to show that I've actually overestimated just how important social trust is in terms of governance. But just off the top of your head, how many of these pre-packaged political theories, how many of them make a big fuss out of something like trust? I can't think of a single one. Like trust as a major ingredient. They talk about these political values, like equality or liberty, not really defined that well. But even if they define these things perfectly, right, they'll say these things are going to be very conducive to the success of this theory. One or another form of justice, procedural justice, like all these things, and that's all well and good, but that's background decoration. But it's always baked into the theory, and the theories clash among each other because of that. But those of us who want to be extremely attentive to outcomes, we can't overlook stuff like this. We can't overlook the link between health, physical activity, and trust as well as better political outcomes. So, not to belabor the point, but I'm just so frustrated that none of this is ever... You're not going to see even your favorite pundit, like the best of the pundits, you're not going to see him talk about stuff like this, right? David Pakman, in between ragging on Marjorie Taylor Greene or Lauren Boebert or whoever else is the biggest clown in Red America, right? You won't find him devote 1 out of every 100 videos on stuff like this. And he is one of the more responsible pundits and kind of potty-trained commentators, right? Likewise, the flip side of David Pakman, whoever that might be, in between ragging on Rashida Tlaib or whoever else, I'm forgetting the names now, the sort of the clowns in Blue America, you're not going to find a ratio that's as lopsided as 1 video on this for every 100 videos on something other than this, something sensational. You're not going to find a ratio even as bad as that. It's just these agendas, the visible pundits in terms of digital media are every bit as bad and worse than the pundits, the pre-digital media pundits, the dinosaur media pundits. It's just attack mode, right? Don't valorize Blue. Like David Pakman doesn't want to valorize Blue America by any stretch of the imagination. That's not the game plan. Neither does, Cenk Uygur or Sam Cedar. None of these people want to say that Blue America is great, but they want to discredit Red America by pouncing on the clowns in Red America. And that takes up 99% of the airtime. Maybe not 99%, but a disproportionate amount of airtime. And in so doing, overlooks what actually, instead of discrediting the outgroup, pay attention to stuff like this and spread the information and incentivize people to get healthier so that, they probably trust each other more, and that being more conducive to trusting institutions and that leading to cooperation. And I don't see how you can go wrong with stuff like that. But instead, and it's not just them, you almost can't blame the pundits, right? Because they're just doing what they're being incentivized to do by the audiences. So it comes back to the audiences for these channels need to know better. The moment you were paying attention to someone who's pouncing on the clowns in the ideological outgroup party, because the goal is to discredit Red America as a whole, the base, not just the insiders, but the base as well, you're going to end up embarking on a kind of tunnel vision and in a kind of monomania that's going to cause you to just overlook stuff that I think I think, is actually more important if you're concerned with outcomes. Stuff like this. Now, just a bit on contextualism, because I did drop it as a ism earlier in the video, but I didn't really define it. I really like this entry on it. Maybe this is the very first thing I'm going to link. Not entry, but this essay on it, because it really covers it in all these different ways. In this article, we articulate and defend a contextual approach to political theory. I would have said meta-political theory, but okay. According to what we shall call iterative contextualism, context has two important roles to play in determining what is required by justice. Justice doesn't have to be the name of the game. Justice can be one of the things here, but yeah, this is kind of odd that they would name drop justice and kind of leave it open to interpretation as to whether pluralists who are concerned with things outside of justice might be drawn to contextualism, but this is how they want to put it, so that's fine. Like you can be a welfarist and endorse contextualism. Like a welfarist would think maybe justice ought to cede a lot of ground to interests of welfare, but yeah, be that as it may. First, it is through the exploration and evaluation of multiple contexts that general principles are devised, revised, and refined. Second, significant weight should be given to the norms to be found in specific contexts because the people affected by those norms strongly identify with them. Having said this, the application of general principles to particular contexts may still result in recommendations which deviate to some degree from the prevailing norms. So it's not just a mindless conventionalism, right? When I say contextualism, I'm not saying it's a mindless, like just accept conventions, as this paper goes on to explain. This essay, not paper. It's the second time I made that mistake. I'm just gonna get a drink of water again. Sorry, I probably should edit these drinks of water out, but I'm probably gonna get lazy, so just fair warning. You're gonna have these little pauses as I take my little drinks. Significant weight should be given to the norms to be found in specific contexts because the people affected by those norms strongly identify with them. Having said this, the application of general principles to particular contexts may still result in recommendations which deviate to some degree from the prevailing norms. Can't stress this part enough. Not endorsing conventionalism, just as you know that I would never in a million years endorse it in pre-political, ethical, or evaluative contexts. I'm not endorsing it even in these political contexts that I do believe need to be more pragmatic, but pragmatism doesn't mean acceptance of conventions and just go along to get along. That's not what it means. In this case, we shall argue that although justice requires something other than what local norms say, what is required is likely to be intimated by the relevant context. Thus, whilst considerations of identification act as significant constraints on iterative contextualists' thinking, the idea of intimations provides them with an important resource. When considering what justice requires in a particular situation, political theorists may feel two impulses. Obviously, the impulse... it's fair, actually. I was going to say that, there can be more than two impulses, but no, that's probably me being overly imaginative. In history, there really have been these two impulses, the foundationalist one and the contextualist one. The very first divide is that sort of divide. One is to draw back from the situation in order to search for universally valid and objectively grounded knowledge of justice, which can be applied to each and every situation in which relevantly similar issues of fairness are at stake. The other impulse is to get closer to the particular situation with which they are concerned in an attempt to determine what is required by justice by immersing themselves in the specific details of this local context. Thus, for every Plato seeking knowledge of an eternal and unchanging idea of justice, there is an Aristotle developing a detailed typology of existing political systems in order to understand how best to fashion constitutions for peoples with different characteristics and resources. I don't really know if Aristotle did that, but okay. I guess I just haven't read the ins and outs of Aristotelian political theory enough. But of what I have read, no, I don't think Aristotle was anywhere near contextual enough. In our own time, we may say that for every Cohen seeking to articulate principles of justice wholly independent of any facts about the world as we know it, there is a Walzer arguing that what justice requires is highly dependent on the meaning of the social goods available to be distributed in each particular political community. Absolutely. And so those of you who keep, tabs on my YouTube community page will know I've sort of shared this a couple of times in the past, or at least I've smuggled it in at the bottom of some other things that I've shared. So this is not going to be news to you, but I felt that it's kind of a crime that I never put this in a video. So I finally decided this will be the perfect video to do that in. And then there's another one that unfortunately I can't access, but the abstract is very appetizing. So I'm going to share the abstract because that is in itself informative enough. Contextualism in political philosophy is a methodological approach according to which attention to context is crucial in normative political argument. Contextualism takes many forms, some not explicitly labeled as such, including doctrines of practice dependence. Can't pronounce this gentleman's name, or if it's even a gentleman. Yeah, see, I thought I read this, and I saw nothing out of the ordinary with this abstract, but yeah, I don't know what they mean by this. I'll look that up later. Such and such ideas of politics as the pursuit of intimations, as well as elements of realist political theory and critical theory approaches. Not based on what this paper says, I can tell you that much, but yeah, this is a bit different. Existing literature on contextualism roughly divides into two parts. One part consists of substantive work by theorists who espouse a contextualist approach, but who often do not set out in much detail in which way their work is contextualist or what their contextualism consists in as a method. The other part consists in methodological discussions of contextualism, which are mainly critical and focus on problems in defining and defending contextualism. Therefore, while many meta-political, it's not just ordinary political theory, Jesus. While many meta-political theorists agree on the need for attention to context, there is relatively little clarity concerning what contextualism as a method actually involves. I'm getting tired. I'm just going to move toward the finish of this because I don't want to take another drink of water and have you hear that and have there be a bit of dead air. So the psychologism page also is, I can't not mention psychologism in this video because it's what Haidt does. It's what Haidt does in his merry band of, what should I even call them? The people who kind of prop him up. The people in the Heterodox Academy is in love with Jonathan Haidt. So I guess we can call those people his kind of underlings who, instead of just being critical of him and giving him pushback that you see in all these papers that, especially when combined together, show just what a mistake it is to inject psychologism into political thinking. Many authors use the term psychologism for what they perceive as the mistake of identifying non-psychological with psychological entities. For instance, philosophers who think that logical laws are not psychological laws would view it as psychologism to identify the two. Other authors use the term in a neutral, descriptive, or even in a positive sense. So I'm definitely using it as a pejorative here because I'm talking about Mr. Haidt, who needs to be pressed on this. In all these interviews, none of this ever comes up, and it's just amazing and infuriating that someone can go to so many different, be invited to so many different prestigious and otherwise critical and skeptical outlets that are far better than your average bear. One of these outlets that just, tries to discredit Red America or Blue America. No, TED doesn't do that. TED doesn't have that sort of ideological victory at all costs. Neither does, like I said, Heterodox Academy. These are much better than your average sort of commentary. I haven't seen this yet, but I'm sure I'll just cringe my way and facepalm my way throughout the whole thing. Pinker, Haidt, and Mr. Peterson. Maybe I'll after I upload this, I'll give that a shake and probably rage quit after 10 minutes, because like they just act as if none of this exists when they talk about just some sort of we're all captured by our neurology. That's what this should be called, neurological capture. We are kind of waving the white flag in terms of neurological capture, and but we're the anti-identitarians, always warning people about identity politics. Well, you're warning them about existing identity politics run amok, sort of identitarianism on steroids. You are doing that, and kudos to you for doing that, but you're completely ignoring the precursors to identity politics, which is this freaking horseshit about how we all inherit things on arrival, and we can't think outside it. No matter how much understanding, not necessarily knowledge, but no matter how much understanding we acquire, we're all going to be captured. No, the fuck we're not. And so, at least when it comes to TED, Heterodox Academy, and the quasi-impressive outlets that are fairly recognizable, and they're not as recognizable as Fox News or MSNBC by any stretch of the imagination, but they're big enough to the point where I think I should be able to demand more of them. That when you invite people like this, and you invite them over and over and over again, at least at some point press them on the fact that they're spreading things. They're spreading, maybe we can call it staticism, or at least to some extent, right? Certain convictions you have, you cannot shake because you have them and you've always had them. Convictions as these static things. No, especially when it comes to two areas, right? So what I said before, disagreements which are over purely factual affairs, or let's say somewhat non-factual affairs, but for which facts still do some of the sort of blinkering. The facts have a blinkering effect, even though the issue itself is not purely a factual issue, right? And then the third round, it's just the purely pre-factual things, which, yes, that does require more than what I'm saying here. I understand that. That requires the philosophy seminar, and I'm not even trying to do that. So there are some things, absolutely, but it's the smallest of these big three. The factual, the middle of the road, and the pre-factual. People can change to a great extent on the factual, to the extent that they're just simply deluded about some aspect of empirical reality, and then that middle of the road where some of those mistaken factual views blur the otherwise non-factual. So no need to belabor the point. I think I've said everything I wanted to say. Sorry, this is like almost 35 minutes. Jesus, I'm at the 35-minute mark. This is unacceptable. I just know that I had a lot to connect here, and maybe I should have put the part on physical activity as a separate video, because it shouldn't get lost in the shuffle, and it kind of will. So maybe I'll return to the physical activity and the trust things, and how crucial trust is to functional modern governments. And rightly earned trust. I'm not just saying people should be mindlessly trusting, but right now the problem is there's more mindless distrust than mindless trust, and that is, I guess, a separate issue, which if I get into now, I'll just apologize again about how long this has gone on for. But I actually wanted to discuss more. I wanted to discuss, because he says the moral roots of liberals and conservatives, and just totally neglecting the question of why should moral roots be that determinant in whether you are a liberal or a conservative? Why should we assume a relatively straight, a linear line between our morals and our politics? I'm not saying there is zero line, but, and here I'm probably going to insert one of my flowcharts to show exactly what I'm talking about. I don't have it handy now because I didn't really prepare for this, but I created a really kick-ass flowchart for what I'm talking about here. The zigzaggy line between our moral thinking and political thinking. It's got to be a zigzaggy line. And the moment you turn it into a straightforward line, you are just doing what your formulaic libertarians do when they talk about, you trespassed on my property, so you committed this like secondhand rape against me. Like remember Molyneux, Stefan Molyneux from back in the day? I mean, he just milked these things for everything they were worth, every single video, right? And that really only makes sense. That only makes sense if you believe that politics and political thinking is really just a kind of public morality. It's just public spirited ethics. That's when we're talking about politics. But obviously, it's got to be a very zigzaggy and more disciplined line. Political moralists are mistaken if they think that second order questions, especially, like maybe first order questions, okay, we can debate, but these second order questions and non-basic liberties can be moralized, right? So, okay, basic liberties, as discussed by, for example, John Rawls, okay, fair enough. Moralize those. I'll still give you some pushback. But these people who either don't realize that they need to draw lines between basic and non-basic liberties, and the non-basic ones being completely open to provision and just a kind of non-moralized, pragmatic discourse, it's so bad. It's tragically bad. And so, at no point in this presentation does he call into question the very mere idea that moral roots, which are to him psychological, should have this much sway when it comes to public affairs, like civics. Like we just need to go and shove them into people's faces. Actually, you know what? Let me just, because the Stanford Encyclopedia entry on Rawls nails this really well. Just the very entry on it. Separateness of persons. Yeah, that's a separate video. God, I can't wait to discuss that in a video that warrants it. Right? Because John Rawls was an American political philosopher in the liberal tradition. His theory of justice as fairness describes a society of free citizens holding equal basic rights and cooperating within an egalitarian economic system. His theory of political liberalism explores the legitimate use of political power in a democracy and envisions how civic unity might endure despite the diversity of worldviews that free institutions allow. Civic unity despite the diversity of worldviews. You can't have an overly moralized politics when you sign off for this. Like, if you believe in over moralized political thinking, a sentence like this should just strike you as, like, you should almost shiver as you read it, as if there's something wrong with it, right? Civic unity and a diversity of worldviews. But see, when people read it, they don't think anything's wrong with it unless you really press them on the implications. Just how demanding civic unity is and how diversity of worldviews, you have to give up some of yourself, some of your moral self when you engage in these kinds of collaborative, public, spirited discussions. You have to be within, not perfectly within the Overton window, but you can be universes away from it and barge in and just think that it doesn't matter that you are universes out of it. So Rawls made that point about as well as any recent, semi-recent, visible political philosopher who I've read has. So that's why I always kind of like to return to him. And now I am at 41 minutes. See, it's just because I'm afraid I'll forget something. And I will forget something definitely, but I don't want to go back to recording. I just want to connect this to what I had before and just be done with it. I mean, ironic, in the previous thing I recorded, I said I didn't want this to be 2 hours, but it's shaping up to be something like that, right? moral roots of liberals and conservatives. No, how about the pragmatic roots? There we go, right? Imagine this video was titled The Pragmatic Roots of Liberals and Conservatives. Then I would see something truly interesting to discuss, because we might say that liberals have a certain kind of idea of what is practically necessary for a stable and just and I guess free world, and conservatives just have a completely different idea of what is pragmatically necessary, not what is morally non-negotiable, right? And he just doesn't call any of that into question. And he's a political commentator that is kind of almost a political celebrity at this point. And these two guys certainly are as well. And it makes me nauseous. And also there's a oh God, I'll take a deep dive into empirical approaches to moral character. I'll take a deep dive at some point later in a separate video, but there's also this idea that he just mindlessly accepts to moral character as well as moral psychology. See, the Stanford Encyclopedia has these two entries: empirical approaches to both moral character and moral psychology. And I mean, it's just, I think that the debates that were really vicious back in the day, like in the 70s, 80s, to some extent the 90s, it was called the Situationist Challenge. Situationism. Well, not in philosophy, but in psychology. So maybe I need to do this. Situationism. Oh, I'm having the hardest time now finding it, but there's the Situationist Challenge, which just challenges this whole idea that people have stable character traits, and specifically stable moral character traits. You just come up with you change a few non-moral features of a circumstance that these subjects who have been experimented on find themselves in. Just change a few non-moral features like ambient sounds, scents, stuff like that. And what people do, the broad argumentative strategy proceeded in two stages. Stage one, draw on studies in psychology to show that people typically do not have what they call global character traits. Stage two, show that this is a serious problem for Aristotelian virtue ethics, as well as any other view in normative ethics which is committed to, in some central way, to global character traits. First, we need to clarify what global character traits are before diving into the details of the two stages. According to Doris, global character traits have two main features: consistency. Character traits are reliably manifested in trait-relevant behavior across a diversity of trait-relevant eliciting conditions that may vary widely in their conduciveness to the manifestation of the trait in question. Stability. Character traits are reliably manifested in trait-relevant behavior over iterated trials of similar trait-relevant eliciting conditions. Third feature he mentions, evaluative integration, does not factor much into this discussion. Right, so against widespread possession of global character traits. On the basis of certain studies in psychology, Harman and Doris reason roughly as follows. If there is widespread possession of the traditional virtues and vices understood as global character traits, then systematic empirical observation using appropriate psychology experiments will reveal most people behaving in a certain kind of way. However, systematic empirical observation using appropriate psychology experiments fails to reveal most people act in this kind of way. Therefore, there is not widespread possession of the traditional virtues and vices understood as global character traits. And then there is, these experiments specifically. Dime in the phone booth. The psychologist so-and-so had an experimental group find a dime in the coin return slot of a phone booth, whereas the control group did not. Individuals in both groups subsequently had a chance to help pick up dropped papers. 88% in the experimental group helped, only 4% in the control group helped. So it's from 1972, but it's been fairly replicated. There were replication problems with the study, but there are many other studies on the effect of mood on helping which found a similar pattern. So this specific one wasn't, but many other ones found a similar pattern, so replicated well enough. And look, there have been others, and I guess this is the fifth time I'm going to say that I'm now really stretching my time privileges here, because this is minute 47 now, but for Pete's sake, the moral roots of these people who have persistently been shown to not have moral roots, according to this situationist challenge in psychology. So maybe he just thinks that it's like, he thinks that the victory of the critics of situationism is such an ironclad victory that he doesn't even need to mention the existence of situationism. Whereas I'm inclined to the polar opposite view. I think situationism has been so damn empirically impressive to show people don't have these global character traits that I'm almost tempted to just operate as if situationism is true and not even mention that there's still kind of a lingering debate going on about this sort of stuff. But the situationists are not the ones being invited to all these prestigious platforms with fairly high viewerships. It's the people who pretend situationism doesn't even exist as a threat to the narratives they're proliferating. It pisses me the fuck off. But anyway. Alright, so this is going to probably be a 2-hour plus video when everything else is combined. And if you've made it this far, my gratitude and my condolences, I guess, because you kind of had to hear me repeat a couple of things for emphasis. But, I mean, how can emphasis not be necessary when just people like me are never going to get invited to these platforms? So it's like, it bears repeating, right? Maybe that'll be the title of this video. It bears repeating.